Chicago. Chicago didn't choose to be America's favorite punchline. It was assigned that role. But the stats people repeat online rarely match reality. Chicago's raw number of shootings is high, but the per capita violent crime rate is lower than many smaller U.S. cities, including Memphis, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Little Rock. Most people never hear that part. A big misunderstanding comes from how Chicago's violence is geographically concentrated. Roughly 6% of the city's land area accounts for nearly 50% of shootings, according to CPD data. Downtown, the North Side, and much of the West Loop have violent crime levels comparable to Boston or Washington, D.C. Another misconception. People compare Chicago's homicide numbers to New York's without mentioning density. Chicago has less than 1/3 of New York's population. Chicago is misunderstood because people mix large numbers, small areas, and big headlines without understanding how crime rates work. New York City. No city in America experiences a bigger perception gap than New York. Ask anyone scrolling social media. NYC is dangerous again. But ask the data. It says the opposite. New York today remains far safer than the 1980s and 1990s. The city recorded over 2,200 homicides in 1990. Recent years hover around 400 to 450, even with population swings. That's an 80% drop. So why does NYC feel more dangerous? Viral subway incidents create strong emotional impressions. A 20-second clip spreads faster than a 20-year trend line. Another misunderstanding comes from NYC's scale. Small increases in crime look massive on charts. But per capita, NYC's violent crime rate is dramatically lower than many U.S. cities with far less public attention, including Baltimore, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Kansas City. There's also confusion between violent crime and disorder. Graffiti, homelessness, and public drug use make people feel unsafe, even if crime statistics don't reflect a major spike. New York's challenge isn't a return to the 1990s. It's a mismatch between visibility, virality, and actual crime data. Statistically, NYC remains one of America's safest large cities, but emotionally, people remember what they see, not what they read. San Francisco. San Francisco's reputation collapsed faster than its office occupancy rate, but the story people repeat isn't the full picture. The city is constantly associated with crime, but the violent crime rate is far lower than many U.S. metros. What San Francisco struggles with is property crime, specifically auto break-ins, and that distinction is almost always lost in national discussions. In 2022, police recorded roughly 25,000 auto break-ins, but violent crime remained near historic lows. Yet the visibility of theft, open-air drug markets, and declining downtown activity shaped a perception that San Francisco is dangerous everywhere, all the time. National outlets use city proper statistics, but the city is only 49 square miles. Any spike looks enormous on per capita charts. None of this denies the city's challenges. Drug deaths surged, retail closures accelerated. But in terms of violent crime risk, which is the metric most people fear, San Francisco ranks below cities like Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Houston, and Atlanta. San Francisco's real crisis is perception, visibility, and uneven disorder, not widespread violent crime. St. Louis. If there were an award for most misunderstood crime statistic in America, St. Louis would win every year. The city consistently appears at the top of most dangerous rankings, but almost nobody understands why. St. Louis's crime rate looks extreme because analysts use city limits data, not metro area data. And St. Louis has the smallest city boundary of any major metro in the U.S., just 62 square miles. Meanwhile, over 2 million people in the suburbs are excluded from the numerator, but included in people's mental picture of the city. This artificially inflates the crime rate and makes St. Louis look worse than it is. Another misunderstanding. Much of the crime is hyper-localized. A few neighborhoods drive the majority of incidents, similar to Chicago. Tourist areas, major employment districts, and the revitalized Central Corridor experience much lower rates. St. Louis's homicide rate is high. That part is true. But the ranking people quote everywhere isn't a ranking of dangerous metros. It's a ranking based on an unusual political boundary created over 100 years ago. In other words, St. Louis didn't become the most dangerous city because of crime alone. It became number one because of math. Detroit. Detroit's reputation is stuck in the 2000s, but the city itself isn't. People still imagine Detroit as a high-crime industrial ruin, but nearly every major metric has improved over the last decade. Homicides have dropped significantly since the bankruptcy era. Auto theft is down compared to early 2000s peaks. Property crime trends are declining. So why do people think Detroit is still collapsing? Because the improvements happened slowly, and the old narrative never updated. Another misunderstood metric. Detroit has a large land area, 139 square miles, but a population that shrank dramatically. This lowers density, increases vacancy, and makes citywide per capita comparisons look harsher than they feel on the ground. Detroit also has neighborhood variability. Downtown, Midtown, Corktown, and the Woodward Corridor have seen billions in redevelopment, tourism returns, and decreasing crime. But national discussions rarely separate recovering areas from struggling ones. Finally, Detroit's national image was shaped during one of the worst economic declines in modern U.S. history. The data has changed, but the story people tell hasn't. Detroit isn't a safe city, but it's also not the dystopia many still imagine. Its misunderstood statistics reflect recovery, uneven progress, and the long shadow of its past. Philadelphia. Philadelphia became a national headline during the 2020 to 2022 homicide spike. What almost nobody outside the region noticed was the sharp improvement afterward. Homicides fell over 20% year to year after 2022. Carjackings, another major concern, dropped significantly after targeted policing and community programs expanded. But because the spotlight was brightest during the spike, the correction never got equal attention. Another misunderstanding. Philadelphia's crime problem is often conflated with center city disorder, which is more visible but not statistically dominant. Most violent incidents occur in specific neighborhoods outside the tourist and business districts. Philadelphia also suffers from big city comparison bias. People compare it to New York because of regional proximity, but the two cities have different densities, demographics, and policing systems, making direct comparisons misleading. Social media amplified isolated events, turning individual incidents into symbols of the entire city. This fueled a perception of accelerating danger, even as official reports showed the opposite. Philadelphia's story isn't denial. Crime rose sharply, but the recovery is real, measurable, and widely misunderstood. Seattle. Seattle didn't suddenly become dangerous. It became visibly disordered. The city's most misunderstood metric is the difference between crime and non-criminal disorder. Visible homelessness, open drug use, and empty downtown blocks created a strong perception of risk. But statistically, Seattle's violent crime rate remains moderate compared to other U.S. metros. Seattle lost hundreds of officers after 2020, slowing response times. This doesn't increase violent crime directly, but it increases public anxiety. Seattle also deals with a statistical quirk. Property crime is high, but homicide rates remain comparatively low. Most people don't separate those categories. The emotional perception of Seattle's safety is dominated by visibility, not numbers. The data shows disorder, not collapse. Miami, most surprising. Miami is the plot twist of American crime statistics. People picture Miami as a neon-soaked, high-crime party city filled with chaos. But the numbers tell a different story. Miami's violent crime rate has fallen dramatically over the last 30 years. The city is statistically safer than many comparable metros, including Atlanta, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Its homicide rate today is a fraction of its 1990s peak. So why does Miami feel unsafe to outsiders? Because the city's pop culture image, crime shows, nightlife, tourism crowds, exaggerates risk. Another misunderstood metric. Miami's explosive population growth increases raw numbers without necessarily increasing rates. People hear more crimes reported without considering the denominator. Downtown, Brickell, Wynwood, and Midtown have become some of the region's most walkable and rapidly developing districts, with consistent safety improvements. Cities don't succeed or fail based on headlines. They rise or fall based on trends, long-term, measurable, and often invisible to casual observers. Crime data is complicated. City limits differ, populations shift, and public fear doesn't always match statistical reality. If you want better cities, start with better information. And sometimes, the cities we fear the most are misunderstood the most.